Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, Labor Day is done, and it's now starting back into school and thinking about what a lot of people think about is sort of the fiscal year, the calendar year, the school year. And the biggest issue, I think, politically, facing Toronto, facing the Greater Toronto Area, facing Ontario, maybe even Canada, maybe even a lot of the world, is housing. And it's an issue that's gotten a ton of attention, and it's probably one of those things that you talked about at cottages or at dinners, barbecues over the weekend. I certainly did. And so I thought we'd interview and bring on our show someone who's been writing a lot about it and is a real expert in this area. Randall Bartlett is his name. He's the Senior Director of Canadian Economics with the Desjardins Group. He's based in Toronto. He leads a team covering the Canadian and provincial economies and housing markets outside of Quebec, as well as government budgets and fiscal policy. Randall Bartlett, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
So what caused this housing crisis, and what is the unbelievable solution? Can it be solved?
Well, I mean, there are a few factors. I think you can break them down into really two different segments, one of which is supply, the other one is demand. So on the demand side, we have, millennials who are coming up, who are the second biggest demographic group after the baby boomers, and are entering their sort of prime home buying years. So they're sort of ages 25 to sort of, I think 35 now, 40. So they're in those prime demographic years. They're forming families, they're doing that sort of thing. So they're starting to buy homes and look to buy homes. So there's that push coming from demand, as well as the fact that we have heightened levels of immigration in Canada as well. So that's putting a lot of pressure on the housing market as well, both market housing as well as rental housing. So we're getting this big demand push for housing at this point in time, particularly coming out of the pandemic.
Randall,
on the other side,
I know some people in that segment, my own kids. And some of their friends, and they have been hunting for homes in Toronto, in Mississauga, and they're going as far as Georgetown, Kitchener-Waterloo, looking for homes. Everything that they would like to live in, everything that was their dream, is priced out of the marketplace, and they're living in 1 and 2 bedroom condos that are 500 to 800 square feet in downtown Toronto, and they're thinking about getting married. They're thinking about having kids in their early 30s.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The dream of, home ownership, detached home, big backyard, all of that sort of thing is getting further and further out of reach for a lot of younger Canadians. And so that's something that certainly is on the mind of them, their parents, their grandparents, and I think, increasingly on the minds of politicians at all levels of government as well, because these folks are voters, and they're, for good reason, not happy with the current state of the housing market in Canada, and so particularly Ontario. And so this is something that I think we're finally starting to see a serious response to. But I mean, the proof of the pudding will be in the tasting if we get politicians taking real action on this.
So demand is way up, but what happened to supply? I heard the statistic that supply today is like 1/4 on a per capita basis that it was when I was a teenager and a young adult.
Well, I think there are a few things affecting supply. I mean, one of which is a lot of zoning changes that happened, especially in the 1970s and 80s in the GTA and in the area surrounding the GTA, like Mississauga, where we actually had a big focus on building more detached homes and focus on single family homes as opposed to increasing density. And so there was a concern around that time that the nature of cities were changing, that we're oversupplying housing coming out of the 1970s, where there was a big push to build a lot more housing as the baby boomers came of age and they were starting families. And so there was a big concern that we're building too much housing, there was too much density, things were changing too fast. A lot of exclusionary zoning came in, so the pace of home building slowed dramatically. So that was a big part of why we have less supply today available on the market. Part of it as well is things like short-term rentals, where a lot of the rental supply and even condos and some detached homes have been coming off the market and put on the short-term rental market. So when you look at the prevalence of Airbnbs relative to, say, hotels, there are Airbnbs in every single neighborhood now, and there's a real incentive, I think, for landlords to move to short-term rentals and away from long-term rentals, because the risk to them is much lower and the potential upside profit-wise is higher as well. And so we're seeing a lot of stock coming off just on the short-term rental side of things as well. So there's less building, and then there's a different sort of use of that built land, that built shelter as well. So that's also part of the story. Now, now we're in the situation where we have this surging demand, we have this long-term dearth of supply, and politicians are starting, I think, to finally wake up and say, okay, now we put in all of these stops to building. Now we've got to start taking these stops away. Otherwise, it is going to be incredibly difficult to meet the needs of Canada's population, especially that younger millennial group that that are coming of age, are starting families, and need that housing.
So let's break down some of these things. So long-term rental that's been converted to short-term rental. Right now in the downtown Toronto area, there's almost no new housing that's come onto the marketplace. Sorry, no new hotels that have come onto the marketplace. And in fact, hotel supply is going down. The Delta Chelsea is being converted, I understand, to residential. And so it's a reduction in supply of hotels in the Toronto area. Not a lot of hotel development. And what I'm told is that land prices are so high that it just doesn't cost, it doesn't make cost sense for anyone to build a hotel, at least in downtown Toronto and in a lot of the greater Toronto area. And the highest sale price for a hotel in the history of Canada was just done in Yorkville recently at over $1 million a room. So hotels are not being built, and hotel prices have gone up, and land prices have gone up, and yet people still want to come to Toronto and go to Blue Jays games. I'm going to one today. So is that bad? Like, really, it sounds to me like Airbnb and short-term rentals were the safety valve in the hotel. And I'm told, frankly, that institutions like Desjardins and other big banks won't even finance hotels in the Toronto marketplace today. So is Airbnb a problem, or has it actually been a safety valve that solved the hotel problem?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I can't speak to decisions that Desjardins has made or hasn't made in terms of financing specific types of investments. But when it comes to what we're seeing in terms of the level of rental stock that's coming off the market, I guess the question is, are they displacing the hotel business, or are they saving the hotel business? And I think when you see the amount of Airbnbs relative to the amount of hoteling available, it seems that there's been a surge of this coming on the market, and that's something that clearly is demanded by many people, and certainly something that, if people own the property, they have a right to be able to earn an income off of it. But it has removed a lot of that rental stock off of the long-term rental stock off of that market, and those folks would have been going to hotels if not going to Airbnbs. So it's become a substitute for hotels,
Yeah.
and so reduce their profitability, and at the same time taking long-term rental stock off the market. So at the end of the day, it is something that is exacerbating our housing crisis in the GTA and in Ontario.
So I think on that one, I think it's actually saved the tourism market. And I think that the hotels weren't going to be built. There wasn't the economics to justify building hotels in the downtown Toronto area. And a lot of those Airbnbs are in places, right around the arena, right downtown in the financial district. There's even big corporate companies like Sonder, et cetera, that are coming in and buying floors of condos and renting them out, sort of like corporate Airbnb. Okay, so let's go back to the other issue that you mentioned, zoning changes that really supported single family dwellings. Was that a good idea, or has it turned out to be a really bad idea?
Well, what it's turned out is that has reduced density essentially in our big cities, and so by reducing density, you just reduce the amount of living space that's available for more people. And so what we've seen is that Toronto actually has some of the lowest density among big cities in Canada. So when you compare them to the top three, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto is the least dense of those. When you look at North America, big five cities outside of Los Angeles, Toronto has the lowest density as well. And so what we've done is what has shifted is that Toronto has moved from a city that was increasing density to one where the pace of increasing density slowed dramatically. And so now for a city of our size, when you compare cities in Europe or Asia, other North American cities, Toronto is much less dense than it would be otherwise. And so the real opportunity here, it seems to be to increase, there's there's no more room for building single family homes within the GTA. It's very, very challenged, and so really the opportunity seems to be to increase density in order to increase the amount of living space that's available for families, and that's focusing on things not just on building condos that are larger, 2 to 3 bedroom condos or purpose-built rentals, but also looking at the missing middle. So things like semi-detached row houses, that sort of thing, where there was very little development relative to what we've seen in the past, and that as a share of overall housing starts had been declining over the last 20, 30 years.
The increased density that you're saying that we need to have, why hasn't it happened in the last couple of years? We had this millennial demand that you talked about, this immigration demand that you mentioned, and if my statistic is right, that per capita housing starts are 1/4 of what they were when I was a young adult. Why hasn't it happened yet?
Well, the reason it hasn't happened yet is that it takes time for politicians to make decisions, feel that pressure, and make those decisions to make those changes. So when you look at the city of Toronto, we just had the approval this spring to build within the GTA in most neighborhoods now, up to 4 unit buildings, up to 4plexes. Prior to that, in most of Toronto, you weren't able to actually build 4plexes, and so politicians have just been slow to act. And obviously, in existing neighborhoods, folks that already live and own in those neighborhoods often don't want to see dramatic changes to the nature of their neighborhoods, and that's completely understandable. And local politicians are responsive to the needs of their voters, and so it's very, there's been a very slow impetus to really start to move the needle on this sort of thing. And it really wasn't until this spring that we actually saw material action take place in Toronto. Prior to that, there had been approval for things like laneway houses and that sort of thing, and so to increase density, but we saw that the impact of that was very, very minimal.
We're chatting tonight with Randall Bartlett from Desjardins Economics about the housing crisis in the Greater Toronto Area, in Ontario, and in Canada generally. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with this incredibly brilliant economist in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is probably one that everyone's been talking about of late over barbecues and dinners, and certainly our politicians have finally been talking about, which is the housing crisis and affordability crisis in the Greater Toronto Area. And our guest is a gentleman that I've read a bunch of his reports and his articles and his posts, and it's Randall Bartlett. Randall Bartlett is the Senior Director of Canadian Economics with Desjardins Group. Before coming to Desjardins, Mr. Bartlett was the Director of Economic Research on OMER's Total Portfolio Management Team, where he was responsible for global economic research and forecasting. Prior to that, he was the Chief Economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy, where he published Canadian Economic, Fiscal, and Policy Analysis. I got to ask you about Fiscal Studies and Democracy. That sounds like a fascinating institute that we really need a little bit more of. He has also held positions at PSP Investments, TD Economics, the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and the Federal Department of Finance. You've got a master's in economics, and did you say a bachelor in math?
Yeah, I have an undergrad in math and economics. Yeah, and
you're a certified financial analyst, so you're a really smart financial guy.
I don't know if that's. I've got a lot of credentials, but I don't know. I don't know if that adds up to smart. So you'll have to tell me.
I'm sure it does. So let's go back to this topic that we were just talking about how politicians have been slow to react to this housing crisis. And, just this past summer, the Prime Minister said at one point in time that housing wasn't a federal responsibility. And, 2 months later, he's having a cabinet retreat that's all talking about housing, and they're bringing housing experts from across the country into chat. So it would appear that people are starting to take attention. Last year, about a year and a half ago, there was a task force of the Ontario government that I think it was called the Housing Affordability Task Force or something like that. And it came forward with 57 recommendations. And I was told that only 6 of them were implemented. I'm not sure if that's exactly right, but not many of them were implemented. And then after the election and they got majority with Bill 23, Bill 109, they started implementing some more of the recommendations. But it seems like, and I think you maybe touched on it in regards to local municipal politicians being very influenced by their local electorate. And part of the problem is that we don't have big turnout. And the big turnout in local elections looks a lot more like me than it does like you. It's older, it's more established, it's maybe homeowner oriented, and young people, the renters, don't tend to vote. And so therefore, have we got a problem in that local municipal politicians really do what NIMBYs want rather than what's right for their city?
Well, I think to your point, I mean, local politicians are the most responsive to the voters who come out, who participate in council meetings, who come to planning reviews, who do that sort of thing, and so they're very responsive to those voters who are the most active, and so that's one of the great things about local democracy. But at the same time, that because turnout is so low and you just get less involvement of people who are renters, who are younger, that sort of thing, those voices tend not to be heard to the same extent. Now, it's a bit of a chicken and egg story in the sense that if those folks want to be heard, they need to come out and they need to participate in those meetings. They need to participate more actively in what's happening locally. I mean, the challenge is a lot of those conversations happen during work hours and during the day and that sort of thing. And so it's more difficult for particularly young professionals, that sort of thing, to come out and participate in those meetings. But there needs to be more of that active discussion, because the reality is, if you're a local politician, your incentive is in part to win the next election, and so you need to be listening to the people who are coming out to vote and representing their interests. And so you're not necessarily representing the interests of future voters. If you are dramatically increasing density and that sort of thing, that's not necessarily going to get you elected in 4 years or less. And so the incentives, I think, make sense for everybody who's involved, but at the same time, that's not necessarily something that's going to end up building us more housing.
So how do we change the incentives, or how do we, overrule or override the incentives? I ended up interviewing Joe Barrich, who is the head of something called Urban Strategies, one of the top planners in the Greater Toronto Area and frankly around the world. And he said, until and unless people are elected on a citywide basis, they're not going to be thinking about what's right for the city. They're only going to be thinking about their next election. And he said it goes farther, Brian, because what ends up happening is these local ward councillors end up treating planning development in their area almost like a fiefdom, a local fiefdom. And if some other councillor votes against or for some development that they don't want in their own area, they're going to object to the other councillor's development or desire. And so therefore, all the councillors do what one local councillors want. They don't rock the boat. And so therefore, you don't have this sort of opposing force that is positive. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Premier put in place these strong mayor powers that could overrule council if they got 1/3 of council to agree with them. So is there a problem with our incentive system in local government where you got, local people being elected by local people with low turnout, and that low turnout tends to be older, whiter, more established homeowners, etc., such that there's no solution because those people are just doing what, as you said, the incentive scheme that's been set up drives them to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate because you're not getting a diverse representation from the community. But at the same time, I mean, whose responsibility is that to some extent? I think it's really the responsibility of not locally elected politicians per se, but of local government to really put in effort to try to increase voter turnout. Even at the provincial level, our voter turnout is very, very low, and so there really should be a push by all participants in the democratic process to really start getting more voter turnout. And certainly when you look at what happened in the most recent mayoral election in Toronto, which was looks like it's going to be a sea change in terms of the approach to policy for the city more broadly relative to what we saw under Mayor Tory. That in and of itself seems to have been a reflection, or potentially a reflection, of the fact that you had voters who are now pushed out of the housing market, who are looking for solutions. They're not looking for the status quo anymore. And so when you have those citywide elections, people seem to be starting to look for change in those citywide politicians and the policies they're bringing in.
The other thing that's happened is that provincial government has sort of come in and overruled some of what the local government have been doing. You've had ministerial zoning orders where they've imposed increase density and change zoning. And there's now some rumors in regards to them dramatically increasing density around transit areas. And it's really almost taking local planning zoning rights away from local councils and giving it to the provincial government and the Minister of Housing. Is that a good idea?
I mean, it's a good question. I think it's really forcing change on those communities that a lot of those communities don't want. Some of them are happy with it, and I look at examples like Guelph and that sort of thing that have become a leader in trying to increase density because they have a large student population and they're not adequately housed. And so there's some cities are certainly already making a lot of those strides. There are a lot of others that are lagging behind, and so in that sense, it is moving the needle much more quickly than I think a lot of communities are comfortable with, and would be the case otherwise. But you're also reducing that local representation, that democratic representation, and so it's whether it's going to be a good thing for housing, I think is yet to be seen. But whether or not it's a good thing for local democracy, I think at the end of the day, it probably isn't to overrule what local citizens want in their own communities.
Okay, so let's. You may not know the actual cases, but there's two that have happened in Mississauga recently. So the old Lakeview Power Generating Station, which is 140 acres, sticking out into Lake Ontario, just south of the QW, Dixie, and Cawthra. The Minister of Housing came in and issued a ministerial zoning order that doubled the density, and took away height limits. And their argument was this is a brand new development. It's on brand new land. It's not impacting the local community, even though the local community had worked over the course of probably a decade and a shorter time period with the developers, but over a decade in regards to what that development's going to be. And the province said maybe there should be a GO train station added into the Lakeshore line to provide transit, but they doubled the density. And then up and down here in Ontario, where they're building the Hazel McCallion LRT, double density on numerous different intersections by the transit. So what that says, if the province is right, is that the local democracy didn't work because it was doing half of what it should have done. Or it says you just got this authoritarian group at the province that are overriding local democracy. Where do you come out on that? Doubling the density is a pretty huge change. It's not like a small incremental change.
No, absolutely. It's a huge change, and I think voters will decide whether or not it's something that that they actions that they support the provincial government taking. If they do think that it's dictatorial and overruling the desires of the community, I mean, people can express that at the ballot box when we go to the next provincial election. But certainly, it's something that the provincial government, I think they're making a decision that they think this is something that's going to pay off for them in the next election and going forward, and something they've made a key pillar of what they want to accomplish. And so really they're taking that gamble, and I guess we'll see what the outcome is in Mississauga after the next election. But some of the recommendations of the Housing Affordability Task Force in Ontario were to dramatically increase density around public transit stations, and actually, get rid of height limits in some cases potentially, or consider getting rid of height limits around public transit stations in order to ensure that we're able to, people can, we increase our density, but then people can also have access to public transit routes to get around Mississauga, get into the GTA, do that sort of thing. And the other thing is around bus routes generally, or streetcar routes, allow for by right zoning for low and medium rises, so up to, I think it was 6 stories. So it's one of those things where they've really focused on trying to, wherever there's public transit offered, trying to increase density as much as possible in order to ensure that we're able to provide adequate housing for people.
Do you think that makes sense? I had Jennifer Keesmaat, the former chief planner of the City of Toronto, on, and she said that we did the right thing on Yonge Street and allowed increased density, increased height around major transit intersections, but we didn't do it on the Bloor-Danforth line. And going across Bloor, you can see the impact of that, even at Jane Street, even at numerous different intersections, other than maybe Roncesvalles or a few. You still got 2-story buildings, and that's it. Did we do something wrong with Bloor and Danforth? Have we learned our lesson, and are we going to change that with new rules in regards to major transit areas?
Yeah, I mean, it's yet to be seen whether or not that's going to change along the Bloor Danforth line, but certainly I'm sure it's something that's on the table because of the fact that there is so much access to public transit in those areas that, and it's so accessible, and the building heights are low, the density is very low of those neighborhoods. I live on the east end of the city, and certainly it's it's very low density on that part of the city. So I imagine there's enormous opportunity there to increase density, and so I have no doubt that it's part of the conversation.
One of the issues that's come up both in that task force, but then also in some of the laws, some of the bills that the provincial government has put forth, is development charges. And you're a math wizard and an economics guy. Maybe you can help answer the question. So, one contention is that development charges are a dramatic increased tax on new development and harm the ability for developers to increase development and increase housing and increase the housing supply. And then local politicians have sometimes said, but if you reduce it, there's going to be a windfall tax to developers, and the local municipality is not going to have the money to actually provide the infrastructure for the development. So where do you come out on development charges? Are these good, or are they bad, and should they be removed like the provincial government is arguing?
So I think it's both, and that it's become, a lot of local governments have become reliant on development charges as a key revenue stream for the municipality, and at the same time it is increasing the cost of housing. It's essentially a tax that the new homeowners have to pay. It's passed on to them, and so I think when you look at Canada more broadly, I think it ranges between 9 and 13% in major cities, development charges, depending on the type of housing. And so it's significant. It adds roughly 10% onto the cost of a home. And certainly it's something that if you were to reduce that, the expectation would be that, that wouldn't be passed on to the consumer. Now, whether it would be or not, I think is an open question, because it could be something that's just taken as additional profit by developers. There'd be nothing, unless it's in legislation, there's nothing that could actually prevent them from just seeing this as a bit of a windfall gain. And so it's an open question as to what the impact is going to have. We've seen different evidence from different cities. In some cases, it's had a marginal impact by getting rid of development charges on reducing housing, and others have argued that it actually is a relatively small cost of the entire project when you compare it to something like the cost of construction overall, the permitting process, that sort of thing. That it's really just one small part of the overall cost of the project. So really, I think the jury's still out on how much of a material impact it could have on reducing home prices and increasing housing supply. But certainly, it's something that municipalities should look at in terms of finding, I think, a more stable source of revenue that would ensure that they could reduce development charges and at least start to see whether or not that's actually having an impetus to build more housing, because keeping it in place certainly isn't having any sort of, I don't think, net benefit to boosting the housing supply in Canada.
The provincial government has argued that development charges have allowed municipalities to keep property taxes from a general population lower than they otherwise would, and specifically in Toronto. And I think I've seen some statistics that Toronto's property taxes based on market value mill rate are 50% of what the surrounding 905 suburbs are. Are property taxes in Toronto unsustainably low, such that the city of Toronto has to have development charges, or has to go hand in to the provincial government looking for money?
Yeah, I think there are two issues there. I think that when you look at Ontario's property taxes, they are roughly half the rate of the 905, and then other big cities in Ontario. And I think that fundamentally is an issue, but they're not actually not all that much higher than, say, or all that much lower than, say, Montreal or Vancouver. They're roughly in line with those. So it seems like big cities across Canada have very low property taxes. Part of that is the economies of scale that come with increased density, but part of that also come from the fact that they're using development charges to keep them lower. So when you look at development charges in Toronto, and it's broadly the case in other big cities in Canada, the development charges actually increase along with density. So the lowest density housing has the lowest development charges. The highest density housing has the highest development charges per unit. And so that's something that in percent terms. So that's something that really is a problem, and should, at the end of the day, if you want to increase density, that that math should be flipped, where you have the lowest development charges as a percent per unit relative to relative for the highest density relative to the lowest density, which should have the highest development charges if you're going to continue using them to encourage building of greater density.
Well, and if development charges truly are to pay for the infrastructure of new development, isn't it exactly opposite? Because what I keep on hearing is that low density, single family home, suburban sprawl actually costs a lot more money from an infrastructure standpoint than high density development. Is that not true?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. There's a lot of really great analysis out there on this that that building infrastructure for low density housing and servicing that infrastructure over the long term actually leads to generally a net cost to the municipality relative to the when you account for the tax revenues that are garnered for low density housing, often suburban housing, and where most of the net revenues, both in terms of property taxes and other types of fees, are generated, tend to be in the most dense areas of cities and sort of the business centers of those cities, and where there's dense housing. Even in low income housing, there tends to be a positive revenue gain generated just because of the density of economic activity that's created in those areas and the lower cost per unit of actually providing services to those homes.
That's interesting. So what you're saying is that from a municipal government standpoint, and frankly, even from some of the NIMBYs that don't want the development, it makes economic sense for them to allow higher density development into their cities in some areas, because it'll keep their property taxes down, because it makes more economic return on the investment.
Absolutely. So if you were to focus on things like public transit corridors, which can then also become commercial corridors as well, then that still allows for lower density housing in surrounding neighborhoods. It just encourages that density, both in terms of residential and commercial activity within those public transit corridors. So and that's where a lot of that revenue is going to be generated on a net basis. That'll help to, I agree, keep the aggregate property taxes down in the broader community.
We're chatting tonight with Randall Bartlett. He's the Senior Director of Canadian Economics with Desjardins Group. He's been a prolific writer on housing issues, and obviously, given his background with OMERS and other institutes, he knows what he's talking about in regards to housing. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Mr. Bartlett on housing. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Housing is the big issue, and we're chatting tonight about it with Randall Bartlett. He is the Senior Director of Canadian Economics with Desjardins Group. Randall, CMHC and Stats Canada came out with a big report just a little while ago that said that the major impact reducing supply was red tape and the time that it took to get approvals. And it's interesting, they talked about the zoning that you mentioned, but they said that was the second most important impact and far less important than just the red tape and time it took to get approvals. Why would time be such a big critical issue? The time to get approvals for developers in restricting supply.
Well, I mean, time is money, right? So when you look at it both from a perspective of cost inputs to a development, as well as changes to interest rates, which have obviously been a big both of those things have had a big impact on the construction sector just in the last couple of years. And so those are two big factors when you delay as to rising input costs into the actual construction process and development process. The other is just the fact that there are other opportunity costs that come along, that developers aren't necessarily just going to sit on something for years while cities kick it back and forth and are unresponsive and that sort of thing. They'll look for other opportunities where they can actually start to invest capital because they have investors that they're accountable to. And so at the end of the day, by delaying processes, what it does is ultimately leads to developments that are sometimes shelved because of the fact that other opportunities come along or just costs rise so much that it no longer becomes a viable investment.
Does anyone get this right? I understand that you've actually taken a look at some other cities and what they do. Some people think Houston's an example because they've just gotten rid of a lot of zoning rules. And then I understand you think that Minneapolis has some good policies. Tell me, does anyone do this right?
Yeah, so Minneapolis is a really good example, I think, of a city that's looked at best practices and has brought a lot of those in. So allowing for sort of fourplexes to be built, they brought this in 2018, sort of by right or sort of by right approval, and so it's assumed that this is going to be will be built unless there's a strong case to not do it. So the default is yes. So that's a big part of it. Changes to zoning rules, providing opening up unused municipal lands for building and development, that sort of thing. And so they had a big push to make a lot of changes. So I think that they've done a really good job. Big focus on density in their case as well, particularly providing tax incentives for purpose-built rentals, which broadly across North America have been built at a much lower pace than what we saw back a few decades ago. And so that's something that they've been really focused on as well. I don't know the case of Houston as well, but it's certainly a very sprawling city. So I'm not sure in that case if it's something that necessarily is focused on density per se, or one that's focused on building. But obviously, Texas is one of the fastest growing state economies in the U.S. and is attracting a lot of investment and a lot of very talented people to it. So they're certainly getting some things right on the economic policy side of things.
I'm told that within 5 years or so, Toronto's going to be the third largest city, metropolitan area in North America. We're going to be rivaling Los Angeles and New York, bigger than Houston, bigger than Dallas, bigger than Chicago, etc. If you were sort of mayor of the Greater Toronto Area, or Minister of Housing, or the person in charge of this economic engine that's going to be the Greater Toronto Area, what would you do to solve this problem?
Well, I think I would focus on obviously increasing density along public transit corridors. I mean, that's the biggest one. So where there's a subway line, dramatically increasing density. So building high rises all the way along all of the major subway lines. The other one is by right zoning in a lot of areas. And I like the recommendations of the Housing Affordability Task Force that along any routes with buses or streetcars being able to build low and mid-rise buildings by right zoning to do that. So I think that's a big place to start. South of Bloor Street, certainly within places like Cabbagetown and that sort of thing that have really been underdeveloped in terms of the opportunity, certainly increasing the height limits for those areas to dramatically increase density in some of those communities where we've seen very little building since the 1970s in terms of increased density. And so I think there's a real opportunity in Toronto to increase that density dramatically. And as you're saying, we're rivaling some of these cities in size in the next 5 to 10 years. Yet outside of Los Angeles, which is a very sprawling city, outside of that, we're not nearly as dense as New York, of course, and not even Chicago in the metro area. So certainly, I think there needs to be a focus on not just building more housing, but rivaling the density of some of these cities. One note that we put out that I thought was fascinating, we were looking at the density of big cities around the world. So let's look at G7 and G20 advanced country capitals. And what we found is that the city that actually has the highest residential density in its metro area among G7 capitals is actually Paris, where they have this enormous density within the metro area. And if you go to Paris, you see that mostly it's low and mid-rise buildings throughout the entire city, which is what it was redesigned to be, 200 years ago. But the density of residential living is very, very high. And when you compare it to somewhere like Tokyo, where we think of Tokyo as having all of these high rises and that sort of thing, actually a lot of those obviously are commercial buildings where you don't actually have residential living. And so it's still much more dense than a place like Toronto in terms of residential living, but not as much as even a place like Paris, which actually has a significant residential density where people live in the core of the city. Again,
Joe Barrage of Urban Strategies was addressing this, and he said, we've got a choice. We can have the density of Paris, but Paris is 6 to 8 stories absolutely everywhere, and there aren't single family homes. And so therefore, if you want mid-rises, you got to have mid-rises almost everywhere. He says one of the big benefits of Toronto is if you take a look at Yonge Street, we've got density at Yonge and Eglinton that's spread out off of Yonge Street. But other than that, most of the density is just on Yonge Street, and half a block away, it's single family homes again. And so therefore, we've got a choice, and the choice is to have density and height along transit corridors, and then the rest of Toronto can stay much the same it is. But we've got to allow that height and density along the transit corridors. So we got a choice. It's big height and big density along transit corridors, or you got to have, height almost everywhere. What do you think we should be doing? The Paris solution or the height solution along transit corridors?
I think the latter is the right place to start. I think the height solution along transit corridors is the starting point, and I think most people are on the same page with that. In big cities like Toronto, that is absolutely the starting point. Not just along subway corridors though, and having unrestricted height limits, but also just along public transit corridors where generally where there are streetcars, where there are buses, allowing for greater density along those. Maybe not condo towers, but certainly low and mid-rise apartment buildings, so we can actually start to increase density everywhere where people can access public transit, which I think is important, and where there's commercial and retail spaces as well. Another opportunity that I think is important, and I think has really become a bigger focus, especially in the GTA, is around things like retail to residential conversion. So looking at shopping centers, particularly those that are have become more challenged as we've moved to online shopping in the last decade or two, and so increasing residential density around those retail spaces. Often they're already around along public transit routes. They already have retail and commercial spaces in them, and so building up more residential. There's a lot of horizontal land that's being unused and a lot of vertical space that's being unused, and so building up around those would be something that I think could very quickly start to increase the number of housing starts in the province, while also ensuring that people have the services that they need to be able to live there and be able to enjoy a lot of the amenities that can be offered.
Yeah, I'm told it's a good idea, but the reason why it's a good idea is just that there's less NIMBYs objecting to building buildings in parking lots. It's not that it's any other brilliant idea. It's just that there's less NIMBYs. Is that true?
Well, I mean, it's tough to say. We've seen that in Montreal, there are actually examples where were proposed retail residential conversions, and they were actually voted down because of a small number of very vocal people within those wards who opposed it, and so actually those projects didn't go ahead. In Toronto, there seems to be a lot more openness to actually making that happen, in part because they're adjacent to residential neighborhoods, but they're not within residential neighborhoods. So they don't actually affect the nature of the neighborhood and the culture of the neighborhood per se, but by making those retail spaces and commercial spaces more viable, because you're adding this residential you're actually adding more options for people who already live in those neighborhoods to be able to be able to go shopping and to get access to goods and services that they need.
Randall, CMHC says we need 1.8 million additional incremental homes over top of what would have been built anyway in Southern Ontario or the Greater Toronto Area in the next 8 years to sort of regain affordability, and 3.5 million homes across Canada, incremental, not in total, but incremental across Canada to regain affordability. And we're sort of building like 20 or 30% of that today. Based on the way that the allocation has been made by the provincial government out to the different municipalities. Have we got any hope in anything in actually achieving this?
Yeah, I think that I'm always try to be optimistic about things. Like I think that we do have hope of certainly changing direction on the situation. We continue to see affordability eroding in the province of Ontario. This is something that has been going on for the last 15 years. Since the global financial crisis, we've seen that housing affordability has continued to erode. This is not a new phenomenon. It just keeps getting worse. And so we really need to start at least changing direction on what's happening here. And so we need politicians at all levels of government to become aligned and actually start moving the needle forward on housing. And I think it starts with things like reducing approval times by ending exclusionary zoning, by the federal government making sure they enter the space, but not to dictate what municipalities do, but to provide financial incentives. Like one of the things that I really like is something like the Housing Accelerator Fund, which was too slow to roll out, too complicated. The window of approval was too short. They're just full of problems, hyper bureaucratic, all of this stuff. But the base idea of essentially a door subsidy provides the incentives for municipalities to really start building and getting shovels in the ground quickly. And I think that concept is the right way for the federal government to go. All the federal government does is tax and transfer. So let's start using some of those transfers to get shovels in the ground. And I think that the federal government really needs to start moving forward on that.
Last question. Interest rates are unbelievably high relative to where they were. Developers aren't building, people aren't buying because they can't afford mortgages. Will we solve this problem before interest rates come down? Can we?
Yeah, I think that this is a long-term problem. It takes time to bring new supply on the market, and so independent of what we see in terms of interest rate policy, even if interest rates were rock bottom today, or we're providing low interest loans to developers to build, it would still take time for new housing supply to come online. I mean, part of the issue is that we do have surging demand right now. So despite the fact that we have the highest interest rates in 20 years and the fastest pace of interest rate increases over a generation, we're actually seeing that the housing market rebounded in April and May, and is now basically seems to be flatlining at a higher level than where we started the year. And so in terms of sales activity and prices, so it's one of those things where there's just so much demand for housing right now that really the response we need is supply. Otherwise, even in a high interest rate environment, people are still going to be looking for those windows of opportunity to go into the housing market. And with rents rising at the pace they are, you look at the price to rent ratios, the price to rent ratio is declining all the time. So even entering the housing market at these high rates and high prices, every month it starts making more sense as we see rents continue to go up at a significant pace.
Randall Bartlett, Desjardins, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to take a final break, come back with some of my own concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody.